When analyzing any piece of evidence for admissibility in a trial, you must approach it systematically, following a strict sequence. The entire structure of the federal rules of evidence hinges on one initial, non-negotiable requirement: relevance. Before we discuss hearsay exceptions, authentication requirements, or testimonial privileges, the evidence must clear this foundational logical test. This chapter introduces the twin pillars establishing this requirement: Federal Rule of Evidence 401, which defines relevance, and Federal Rule of Evidence 402, which governs general admissibility. Think of these two rules as the absolute front door to the courtroom. If evidence cannot satisfy the logical requirements set forth in Rule 401, Rule 402 immediately bars its entry, regardless of how helpful it might seem. Mastering this initial logical hurdle is not just helpful, it is absolutely crucial for success on the bar examination. We begin our journey into evidence law right here, at the threshold of relevance. We now turn our attention specifically to Federal Rule of Evidence 401, which provides the precise definition of relevance. For evidence to be deemed relevant, it must satisfy a straightforward, two-part logical inquiry. First, the evidence must have any tendency to make a fact more or less probable than it would be without the evidence. This establishes the necessary logical connection. Second, that fact itself must be of consequence in determining the action. In other words, the fact must legally matter to the case outcome. It is critical to understand that relevance under Rule 401 is purely a question of logic and probability. It is not a determination of ultimate legal conclusion, such as guilt or liability. If the evidence passes this logical threshold, it is relevant, and only then can we proceed to the next step. We establish that evidence must not only have a logical tendency but must also relate to a fact of consequence. This second requirement is often referred to as materiality. A fact is of consequence if it has any tendency to make the existence of any fact that determines the action more or less probable. What does this mean in practice? It means the fact must relate directly to an element of the claim or defense. Consider a negligence case. Facts relating to duty, breach, causation, or damages are all facts of consequence because proving or disproving them directly impacts liability. Conversely, background facts, such as the color of the plaintiff's car or the defendant's favorite hobby, might be interesting, but if they do not help prove or disprove an element of negligence, they are not facts of consequence under Rule 401. They are merely descriptive, not consequential. Now that we understand that evidence must relate to a fact of consequence, we must examine the nature of the logical connection required by Rule 401. Evidence can prove a fact in two primary ways: directly or circumstantially. Direct evidence, such as an eyewitness testifying they saw the defendant run the red light, directly proves the fact in issue. There is no gap in logic required. Circumstantial evidence, however, requires an inference. For example, tire tracks found at the scene do not directly prove the defendant was driving, but they allow us to reasonably infer that a vehicle matching the defendant's was present. The key distinction is the gap in reasoning. Circumstantial evidence is perfectly acceptable and often highly probative, provided the inference you ask the jury to draw is reasonable and grounded in common sense, rather than being purely speculative. If the connection is too tenuous, the evidence lacks the necessary logical tendency to be relevant. We establish the logical connection required by Rule 401. Now we move to the next critical step in the admissibility process, Federal Rule of Evidence 402, which governs general admissibility. Rule 402 acts as the primary gatekeeper for all evidence. Its mandate is straightforward. If evidence fails the relevance test established in Rule 401, meaning it does not logically tend to make a fact of consequence more or less probable, then that evidence is inadmissible, period. There is no further inquiry needed. However, if the evidence clears the hurdle of relevance, Rule 402 dictates that it is generally admissible. This is the default position. But this admissibility is conditional. Relevant evidence is admitted unless another specific rule of evidence requires its exclusion. This sets the stage perfectly for our next discussion, where we examine those exclusionary rules, starting with the balancing test found in Rule 403. We concluded that under Rule 402, relevant evidence is generally admissible, but only unless another rule requires its exclusion. This is the crucial pivot point. Clearing the logical hurdle of relevance under Rules 401 and 402 is necessary, but it is not sufficient for admission. Evidence must not only be logically relevant but also legally permissible under the rules of policy and discretion. Think of relevance as the entry ticket, but not the final approval stamp. The law recognizes that even highly probative evidence might need to be kept out if its admission serves some greater negative purpose, such as confusing the issues or unfairly prejudicing the jury. This next phase shifts our focus away from pure logical probability and toward the judge's role in ensuring fairness and judicial efficiency. We are now moving into the realm of judicial discretion, beginning with the balancing test of Federal Rule of Evidence 403. We now arrive at the critical judicial checkpoint, Federal Rule of Evidence 403. While evidence might clear the logical hurdle of relevance, Rule 403 grants the judge discretion to exclude it if its usefulness is outweighed by significant dangers. This is the core balancing test. The rule mandates exclusion if the evidence's probative value is substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice, confusion of the issues, misleading the jury, undue delay, wasting time, or needlessly presenting cumulative evidence. Note the critical standard, substantially outweighed. This demands a significant imbalance, not just a slight risk. Visually, think of a classic balance scale. On one pan, we place the evidence's ability to prove a fact of consequence, its probative value. On the other pan, we weigh the potential harms, prejudice, confusion, or judicial inefficiency. The judge must actively weigh these competing interests before admitting the evidence. We now zero in on the most frequently cited danger in the Rule 403 Balancing Act: unfair prejudice. What exactly constitutes unfair prejudice? It is not merely that the evidence hurts the opponent's case. All relevant evidence does that. Unfair prejudice arises when the evidence has an undue tendency to appeal to the jury's emotions, their sympathy, anger, or fear, rather than engaging their reason and logic regarding the facts in dispute. When this happens, the jury risks deciding the case based on bias or raw emotion instead of the established evidence. Consider an example. Evidence showing the defendant is generally a bad person, perhaps irrelevant past bad acts used solely for character assassination. This evidence has low probative value regarding the specific issue at hand, but extremely high potential to inflame the jury. The judge must exclude this type of evidence because the emotional impact substantially outweighs its actual usefulness in proving the case. Having thoroughly examined the balancing required under Rule 403, let us now consolidate everything we have learned into the definitive three-step framework for evidence admissibility. This sequence is your roadmap for the bar exam. Step 1 is always Federal Rule of Evidence 401. Is the evidence logically relevant? Does it make a fact of consequence more or less probable? If the answer is yes, we proceed to Step 2, Federal Rule of Evidence 402. This rule states that relevant evidence is admissible unless excluded by another rule. It is the default admission rule. If it passes 401 and 402, we arrive at Step 3, Federal Rule of Evidence 403. Here, the judge must balance the evidence's probative value against dangers like unfair prejudice or confusion. Crucially, remember the judge determines relevance under 401 and 402, but exercises discretion when excluding under 403. Master this sequence, practice applying it repeatedly, and you will be well prepared for any evidence question on the exam.